Hello, ladies. I have my husband with me today, and so this is Stanley Sherman.
Nice to meet you.
And we were discussing my next video, and he would say, "You should say this, and you should say that." And I said, "Well, why don't you say it?" So I've got him here to say a few things about home education and how unfortunate it is that we allow the government education system to control our actions in public school. For example, constantly joining huge homeschool groups and co-ops that just keep us back in the social system that we tried so hard to get out of. And we talked about how the public school system is not a good guide for our lives.
Well, one reason why we started homeschooling in the first place was because of the state-run public education system. And so I was commenting to Lydia, why should we pattern our homeschooling after a failed system? We have a different set of values that guide us in homeschooling, and it's far different than the education system that's prevalent today in the public sector, which tends to try to propagandize more than really educate.
That's right. And we were homeschooling in the first place so that we could break the cycle of the socialization that left out the rest of the family. For example, if you had your children in public school, you weren't free to go to weddings and family reunions and things during the school year. You couldn't take any time off, and they restricted your schedule, 5 days a week and then weekends off, and everybody was off at the same time. Holidays were at the same time, and my husband had a different schedule, which was very sad because sometimes he would be home on a non-holiday, and my children had to go to school and they didn't get to see their dad. So we changed all that, and we also were trying to break the cycle of what we saw in the world with relationships with the parents and the grandparents and the sons and daughters and grandchildren, so that we could interact together. We are interdependent, not so independent. Although we want a certain type of independence, we are interdependent. We interact, and so there'd be the mother, the grandmother, and of course there are exceptions. We know you don't want your children to be influenced by grandparents who are very, very worldly. And
this is one tendency. Sometimes homeschool families, they tend to get isolated, and this would include isolation from even the greater nuclear family, or the greater family, extended family I'm trying to think of. But anyway, you see a precedent set in the Bible where Paul wrote to Timothy, and of course Paul wrote by inspiration of the Holy Scriptures, when he said, and let me read it here in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, "For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well." And so here we see the influence not only of the parents but the grandparents as well. If the grandparents are Christian, or they're very moral people and they're very good people, then they should be included in the homeschool experience because they have wisdom. All of us, when we get older, look back over our lives and see that we made many mistakes, things if we had the opportunity over again, we would change that. And a lot of times this wisdom that we come up with, that we understand now what would have been the right way, was actually what our parents taught us in the beginning, and we maybe ignored that or thought we had a better plan. So we want to be sure that we don't participate in the current trend, which seems to be a national psychological disease, or whatever you want to call it, where there's this isolation spirit, where one generation doesn't want the former generation included in their activities or their training experiences or whatever.
And I want to also mention that Jesus said, "Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul." Now, let's remember the mind is not more important. I mean, why not educate the heart? everybody's wanting to educate the mind, and so grandmother wants a letter, a phone call, wants a visit, and oh no, we have to do school, we have to do homeschool. So maybe someone might suggest, well, use letter writing as part of your school. Well then, oh yeah, we could do it as part of our school. So then, the mind and the education of the mind is so important. But let us remember to educate the heart and the soul, and not just focus on the mind. And this is what the public schools have done. They are focusing on the mind. At homeschool, we wanted to change that. We want to also educate the heart. What is the point of teaching your child about nuclear science if you don't teach him how to use it within God's realm? Or what is the point of teaching them about how to do a business if you don't teach him how to do it according to biblical standards? What is the point of teaching them about sociological things like how people are related and where they came from, and doing great genealogies if you don't teach them to love the parents and the grandparents and that sort of thing?
Well, one thing that's we see today is whenever you try to cut off maybe the influence of your parents upon which would be their grandparents.
And we're speaking of good parents. We're not speaking of vile people.
You're cutting off a great source of wisdom. And the current generation is tied in so much with technology, the cell phones and everything. I've talked to several people who went to family reunions hoping that they could get cousins to get acquainted with one another. And so they were saying as they sat around, they were in the living room together, that the kids, instead of interacting with the cousins, instead of interacting with one another, were actually glued looking at the screen of their cell phone, and there was no communication taking place. And so in homeschool, it's important not only to get education on the basics in knowledge, but also relationships. You need to teach the importance of listening to older people, to interacting, to communicating with others, because if this is not done, then we're going to raise a generation that's totally has an isolationist complex,
or
and
cold.
Their relationships are going to suffer. They're not going to know how to interact with people that are. This is one thing. I used to teach school, or I trained to be a teacher, and I noticed that even in the public schools, they talk about socialization, and how one of the criticisms of homeschoolers is, oh, well, they're not getting socialized. Well, let me tell you, in the elementary area where I was substitute teaching one time, it was so regimented that children were assigned to sit in the cafeteria across from other children, or on the playground. They only got so much time, and usually the ones that were good friends, they would only associate with their friends. They would not interact with others. And so you didn't have very good socialization. And then also, if you go to talk sometimes to a teenager who's totally been immersed with their own peers, it's difficult to communicate with them because you're like you're from another planet. Whereas a homeschooled child is exposed not only to peers of their age, but they know how to interact with older people. They have no hesitation going up to an elderly person and talking with them. So actually, a homeschooler is much better socialized than a typical public school student, in my estimation.
And so, as homeschoolers, let us try to break this cycle of some of the alarming social trends we're seeing in the public school and in the world. And don't pattern everything after the homeschool. Interact with the generations. And so anyway, I want to thank you all for coming. And
nice to get acquainted with you.
And I hope I can persuade him to come back. If you like him, let me know and leave a comment. See you next time. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.